With alerting, we have a similar design concept to the current alerting. Instead of checks, we call them rules, but the actual usage is relatively similar. What we do have that's new is groups. A group is basically a namespaced group of logs where you can define how often an expression will be assessed. And this is the first thing you'll have to do when you start using the alert feature. So here you can see I currently have 3 groups, one for my applications, one for logging content itself, and one for metric-based alerts. My logging ones, for example, they check every 15 minutes. I don't need them to check instantaneously, so I can kind of give it a bit more time, whereas the application one I want live, so that checks every minute. And there are 4 types of alerts I'm going to show you today. The first one is an event-based alert. An event-based alert lets you know that something specific has happened. So if I now create a new rule, here you can see it has 4 components. It has your log expression itself, it has a rule name, it has where the subscribers are, so where you want it to go, and it has a few optional fields. You can, of course, write raw logql here, but instead I'm just going to use a saved query. In my case, I'm going to look for any array Java lang out of memory errors. This is because the app I'm using, it's the same one as the last webinar, and it has a known issue where you will have some requests trigger an out of memory error, which will then crash the server and redeploy. I need to give it a name, out of memory, check. I need to give it a subscription. So in this case, I'm going to select a Slack webhook. And then you've got 3 options. So you have a pending period, which I'll get to later for different alert types. You have a summary just to tell other users on your account what the alert's for. So alert on out of memory, check system has recovered. You're just basically saying what the alert does and what you may need to do because of it. And then you can additionally specify a runbook. So if you have runbooks in your organization, be that for how to action these alerts in a specific case, or what you need to do, who you need to contact, things like this, you can just put a link to that there and it will live in the alert. I'm going to save that now. And that's going to start loading up into the system and it's going to start checking. My next alert type is a rate-based alert. Rates are a function of logql, which effectively means instead of using the value of the numerical function or field of a log, you can actually use the rate of change for that. The key usage of this is looking for log floods, which I already have an example. You see here, I'm using the rate function on all logs, and I'm summing this by job. I've set my threshold on this to over 20. So I would need over 20 logs per second in order for this alert to fire. Now we are improving this graph here, because right now you'll see with the threshold set, you may not see data unless the alert's already fired. But you actually see, if you look at the data, I'm running at a peak, maybe 12, 13 logs a second per job. So if I set this to 20, it currently won't alert. But in future, we'll basically have a threshold line draw on the graph like we do with the current alert system, so that even with the value, you can see your logs and what you would do in a better behavior pattern. Now on this log, obviously I'm going to push over, not Slack. This integrates with your existing subscriptions. So any you've already configured or any you make in the current alerting would work here. Optional here, I do use the pending period. This means that I must have the logs for more than 20 logs per second for a maximum, for a minimum of 5 minutes. The reason I use this for log flood is that I don't want to have a server restart that expands logs for 30 seconds, trip the alarm. I want it to be kind of an prevailing log flood, so I know there is a genuine problem. The next 2 examples are value-based views you can get from running a function on your logs in logql, or you can use the field in a log itself by unwrapping the log content. A log function would be something like a sum over time, whereas a metric log would be unwrapping, say, the execution time of a request. I've got examples of both here. If I look at my first one, you can see here that I'm again using the rate function, but I'm comparing 2 values. I'm looking at the rate of errors in my logs versus all logs. What this gives me is it gives me a percentage. I can create an alert that says if at any point, if 5% of the logs I'm ingesting are errors, I need to know. Normally, I would say I don't actually have any logs ingesting in this application. If suddenly 5% of them are errors, this probably means something's gone wrong down the system and it needs to be addressed. For the final example, we're going to look at a high CPU consumption. And this is using values within the logs themselves. So here, if I expand this, I actually have 2 values. I'm using my request log and I'm breaking the results down by the URL of the request. And I'm comparing the CPU time of the request to the execution time itself. With that, I can generate this query, which basically results in, if at any point one specific page starts taking more than 40% of its time in CPU for a request, I need to know. It's showing me the request having the most impact on performance. But I could do something similar with any metric in my logs. This could be looking at database time versus execution time, or memory versus garbage collection, or system CPU versus process CPU, or anything custom that you send us, it can use the same logic there. You can use these values to alert basically on anything you may need. So it's quite flexible in terms of what you can alert on, how often you can alert, and then what you can do from those alerts. So I run a page and that will have triggered an alert. So you can see now I have 2 checks in a firing state. This means 2 of my checks right now are in a state where they have fired from the rule and the alert has gone off, and both of these go to Slack. But if I go to my Slack, I can now see that we have 2 alerts firing. At 4:57 p.m., we had a high CPU consumption alarm go off. And you see this resolved itself at 5:02 p.m. We see here that my outer memory check's just gone off, and that happened at 5:14 p.m. So now if we dive into the details of this, this is still being improved. So the template we have for the alerts will be improved over time, but you can see here at least some basic details. It was in my store to application for my standard error. So you can see a bit of context of the alert. And if you had a run book, that would also be here, so you could go directly to that. With these alerts, one thing to mention is that you can get it to the point where queries can become expensive. So if you're comparing, say, 5 values, each one of these queries has to run. So you can get so that these queries can take some time. So you just want to be careful of these queries. You're not running them too often. You're only running them when you need them. And you're not pulling hundreds of values from different places and comparing them in one alert, because that will impact the reliability of the alerts.